Tunde, a young fish seller, works hard to build his business at Mile 12 Market. Despite his efforts, he struggles to attract customers, constantly losing business to Iya Morayo, the elderly woman with the best fish. Her store is always bustling, and Tunde can't understand why his own store, full of fresh fish, remains empty. He becomes frustrated. Tunde wiped the sweat from his forehead, his shirt clinging to his back under the blazing sun. It was another scorching afternoon at Mile 12 Market, and the air smelled of fish and spices, mixed with the heat of the day. He looked around at the market. The stalls crowded with sellers shouting over one another, trying to pull in as many customers as they could. His eyes drifted over to the stall just a few steps from his own, the stall that always seemed to be brimming with customers. Iya Morayo's fish stall. As usual, a small crowd was gathered around the old woman, her hands moving swiftly as she wrapped fish in old newspapers and handed them to her customers, one by one. Tunde sighed, his frustration bubbling up inside him. His stall was just as good, if not better, he thought. The fish he brought in every morning were fresh from the boats, still gleaming with a silvery shine. Yet, here he was, barely making enough sales to cover his cost, while Iya Morayo's business thrived. It doesn't make sense, Tunde muttered under his breath. He glanced down at the few fish he had left, barely touched by any customers that day. The whispers in the market had grown louder in recent weeks. People said there was something strange about Iya Morayo, something beyond just her age and experience. Tunde had overheard some of the older vendors talking in low voices, speculating that the old woman had some sort of special connection, maybe even a spiritual one, that allowed her to always have the best fish. Her fish. Huh. They don't come from the pot like ours, one of the traders had said a few days ago, eyes darting around, to make sure no one was listening. No one sees her buy them. She just has them, as if by magic. Tunde had brushed off the rumors at first. He didn't believe in such nonsense. But as the days wore on, and his own store continued to struggle, doubt crept in. What if there was something behind those whispers? What if Iya Morayo had some secret that she wasn't sharing with anyone? His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she had a special supplier, someone who brought her the best fish in secret. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something supernatural at play. Tunde stood up from his stall, watching Iya Morayo from a distance. She moved with the ease of someone who had been selling fish for decades. Her wrinkled hands expertly scaled the fish, never missing a beat. "I'm going to find out," Tunde muttered, his frustration hardening into determination. "There has to be something she's not telling us. Something that's giving her the edge." He resolved to follow Iya Morayo after the market closed that night. If there was a secret behind her success, Tunde was determined to discover it. He needed to know how she did it, and more importantly, if he could use that knowledge to save his own struggling business. As the sun began to set, Tunde packed up his stall, keeping an eye on Iya Morayo. He waited, heart pounding, as she finished her day's work, wondering if tonight would be the night he uncovered the truth. After the market had emptied and the vendors had packed up, Tunde quietly followed Iya Morayo down a narrow path leading away from the market. He kept a safe distance, careful not to make a sound. The path twisted through a dense patch of bushes and trees, an area he had never explored before. His heart raced with anticipation, his mind buzzing with curiosity and fear. Iya Morayo didn't seem to notice she was being followed. She moved slowly but steadily, carrying a large black sack over her shoulder. Tunde's thoughts raced. Where could she be going this late? The streets around the market were usually empty at night, with everyone rushing home to prepare for the next day. He had heard rumors that Iya Morayo didn't live far from the market, but this path seemed to lead in the opposite direction. As they walked deeper into the trees, the faint sound of water reached Tunde's ears. His heart pounded louder. They were heading towards some kind of water source. A river, perhaps. But there was no river near the market that he knew of. Suddenly, the trees opened up to reveal a small, hidden lagoon. The moonlight glistened off the surface of the water, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Tunde crouched behind a large tree, watching in silence as Iya Morayo approached the edge of the lagoon. She knelt down, placing the sack beside her, and then she did something that made Ton's skin crawl. She began to chant. Softly, her voice low and melodic, speaking words in a language he didn't understand. The air around the lagoon seemed to shift, growing colder, and the water began to ripple even though there was no wind. Tunde held his breath as he watched, too afraid to move. Slowly, as if summoned by her chant, fish began to rise from the water. But these were no ordinary fish. They were larger than any fish Tunde had ever seen, their scales shimmering with an otherworldly light. Their eyes, glowing faintly, seemed to peer into the darkness around them. Iya Morayo scooped the fish into her sack with practiced ease, not even flinching as the glowing creatures wriggled and flopped into her hands. Tunde's mind raced, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. Was this some kind of magic? How could fish appear out of nowhere? Just as Tunde was about to slip away, his foot caught on a branch, snapping it. The sound echoed through the still night air. Iya Morayo's head whipped around, her sharp eyes locking onto the spot where Tunde hid. "Who's there?" she called, her voice no longer soft and frail but commanding and full of power. Tunde froze, his heart pounding in his chest as he realized he had been caught. Tunde's breath itched as Iya Morayo's sharp eyes scanned the trees. He pressed himself against the rough back of the tree, praying she wouldn't see him. But the old woman had already started moving toward him, her movements quick and deliberate. "You, boy," she said, her voice cutting through the night air like a knife. "Come out from where you're hiding." Tunde knew there was no use in running now. His legs felt like jelly, and his mind was racing. Slowly, he stepped out from behind the tree, his hands shaking as he raised them in surrender. Iya Morayo stood before him, her face unreadable in the dim light. But her eyes glowed with an intensity that made him shiver. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold and hard. "Why are you following me?" Tunde opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, and fear gripped him tightly. Iya Morayo's gaze bore into him, waiting for an answer. I didn't mean to, Tunde stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to know how you get your fish. A silence fell between them, the only sound being the soft ripple of the water behind her. Then, to Ton's surprise, Iya Morayo smiled, a thin, knowing smile that made his stomach churn. So, she said softly, you've seen my secret, haven't you? Tunde swallowed hard and nodded. His legs were trembling now, and he couldn't meet her eyes. He had never believed in the supernatural before, but what he had just witnessed at the lagoon shattered any doubts he once had. There was something far more powerful at work here than he could understand. Iya Morayo took a step closer, and Tunde felt his heart pound in his chest. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but the weight of her words pressed down on him. This is not something you should have seen, boy. The spirits of the water do not take kindly to those who spy on their domain. Tunde's mind spun with fear. Spirits, he whispered, his voice trembling. He had heard stories of the spirits in the waters, tales passed down from the elders, but he had always dismissed them as myths. Now, standing before Iya Morayo, he realized that those myths were real. The old woman nodded slowly. Yes, the spirits of the sea. They are the ones who bring me the fish. It is their gift, but it comes with a price. Her eyes darkened, and she reached out, placing a bony hand on his shoulder. You must never speak of what you've seen tonight. If you do, the spirits will come for you, and they are not as forgiving as I am. Tunde's heart raced as her words sank in. He had uncovered the secret behind Iya Morayo's success, but at what cost? His hands shook as he nodded, fear clouding his thoughts. I understand, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The days after Tunde's encounter with Iya Morayo passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. He returned to his store every morning, but he couldn't focus on his work. His mind was consumed by the memory of that night by the lagoon and the old woman's warning. No matter how hard he tried to push it aside, the image of the glowing fish rising from the water haunted him. At night, his dreams were plagued with strange visions. He saw the lagoon again and again, the moonlight reflecting off the water. The spirits whispering in a language he didn't understand. In his dreams, they called to him, their voice growing louder until he woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. During the day, Tunde found it difficult to stay focused. Every time he saw Iya Morayo's store, a cold shiver ran down his spine. She was always there, moving calmly through the crowd, her face betraying no sign that anything had changed. Her customers continued to flock to her stall, oblivious to the dark secret she carried. Tunde, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Whenever he turned around, it felt like eyes were on him, though he could never see who or what it was. It was as if the spirits Iya Morayo had spoken of were already haunting him, watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up. His fellow vendors noticed the change in him. Tunde, you alright? One of them asked one morning as they set up their stalls. You look like you've seen a ghost. Tunde forced a smile, trying to brush off their concern. I'm fine, he muttered, though his voice betrayed him. In truth, he felt anything but fine. The weight of the secret he was carrying pressed down on him, and he had no one to turn to for help. He considered telling someone, just to unburden himself. Maybe if he told another vendor, they could help him make sense of it all. But Iya Morayo's words echoed in his mind. If you speak of this, the spirits will come for you. The fear of what might happen if he broke his silence kept him quiet. One night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, Tunde's thoughts took a darker turn. What if the spirits were already planning to come for him? He had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Even if he kept the secret, what was stopping them from punishing him anyway? The thought gnawed at him, making him feel trapped. No matter what he did, he couldn't escape the fear that the spirits would one day come to collect their price. Tunde's growing paranoia reached a boiling point one morning when he arrived at the market to find his stall in disarray. Fish lay scattered across the ground, their silvery scales dull and lifeless. His stall, which he had left neatly packed the night before, had been overturned, his wares ruined. Heart-pounding. Tunde quickly knelt down, trying to salvage what little he could. As he picked up the fish, he noticed something strange. An odd symbol scratched into the wood of his stall. It was a crude, circular mark that looked like it had been carved with a sharp object. His stomach twisted as he realized he had seen that symbol before, in his dreams. It was the same mark the spirits had shown him. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The spirits were warning him. This was no coincidence. They had come to his stall, leaving their mark behind as a reminder that they were always watching. Tunde stood up, his hands shaking. His fellow vendors were starting to arrive, setting up their stalls for the day. But Tunde felt as though he were in a nightmare. Every sound, every movement around him felt distant and hollow. His mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Iya Morayo's stall was already open, as usual, her customers bustling around her. She glanced at Tunde as he passed, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite read. Was it pity? Or was it a silent reminder of the warning she had given him? Tunde knew he couldn't go on like this. The spirits had marked him, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, they were getting closer. His fear was suffocating, and he needed to act before it was too late. But what could he do? He couldn't confront Iya Morayo, not without risking the wrath of the spirits. And yet, if he did nothing, he was certain they would come for him eventually. The weight of the decision pressed down on him as he considered his options. He could run, leave the market behind and start fresh somewhere else. But the spirits, if they were real, would follow him. There was no escaping them. Or he could confront Iya Morayo and demand answers, though that might provoke her or the spirits even more. Desperation gnawed at Tunde, and he made his choice. He would confront Iya Morayo. Whatever her connection to the spirits was, she held the key to his survival. If he could get her to help him, maybe there was a way out. With his heart pounding in his chest, Tunde made his way through the market, weaving through the crowd until he stood before Iya Morayo's stall. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. Iya Morayo looked up from her walk, her expression unreadable. "So, You've made your choice, she said quietly. As if she had been expecting this all along.